It looked to be the start of a beautiful day. It was 5:30 am in the Lupin household, and for once Cecilia awoke, refreshed, in Cleus's bed. The sunlight poured in through the picture window which stretched across the width of the wall that faced the west, uninterrupted panorama, fells, hills, and the biggest, Helvellyn, a purple-green peak, the distinguished shoulders of its slopes contrasting gloriously with the orange of the already risen sun. She turned over to look at the mountain, staring at it. Close to the end of the summer though it was, Cecilia felt the day was more like that first day of spring. Not the 21st March, the spring equinox, but the first warm day of the young year that you get, which tells you that winter is behind you and that summer, though some rainy and cold days may intrude, is on its way. Glorying in the view, and the preceding, though unprecedented, rest she had achieved, Cecilia wondered on the day ahead. She had arranged, via a short fluke conversation, to meet up with her friend, Petunia Dursley, who was to have been going to Diagon Alley with her younger son Darren to buy his requisite belongings to accompany him to Hedgewards. Cecilia had received a letter by hour later that evening, however, telling her that she was going to have to cancel, but had invited her to her home near Ormskirk that evening. So, her original plan stood. Cleus had organized for the Flu Network to take them both to Diagon Alley at 10 o'clock sharp and, via the fireplace in the leaky cauldron, for a return trip to the cottage at precisely 3. Cecilia looked at Sky as the cuckoo clock below pipped 3 times, indicating 3/4 of an hour. It was a pity in a way they were going shopping that day, for it would have been a perfect day for a long walk. But she was going to be with Septimus, and shopping for the most important day of his future. Cecilia had to impress this fact on Cleus the previous evening when he had told her he could not transport them both to the wizardly shopping shambles, and had reluctantly set up an open look link in the Flu Network which would be open for no more than 30 seconds at precisely the times specified. He was her son. Cecilia has had to explain to Cleus for the umpteenth time, and it was not only her duty but her privilege to take him to buy his school supplies. Banishing the thoughts of her brother-in-law usurping her parental role with his own complicated agenda, Cecilia closed her eyes, thinking further back in the previous evening, when Cleus had brought her back to the cottage from the hospital. Still no progress, no movement, but no chance for the antigen to merely dissipate. You could not directly translate non-wizard medical treatments with those for wizards, which is why healers operated here in this world still, and the professions hadn't been leveled, as had happened in so many other arenas. Wasn't there anything that anyone could do? Surely there had to be. It had hit her as she had sat there, holding her husband's hand, that the inability to cure those bitten by vampires was indeed serious, so maybe, perhaps maybe, the government's measures to limit their number and control their whereabouts in the UK was indeed a sensible one. In her mind's eye Cecilia pictured her son, who would now be snoozing away in his room down the landing, having had a disturbed night, so she had discovered when she went to investigate the twittering and bangs when she had returned from the hospital that had been coming out of his room, Mervyn having kept him awake with frequent visits and rodent casualties. But there was no rush. Despite Cecilia's habit of arriving early to get the shopping done so she could be free and enjoy the bustle of the crowds, it would be an atmosphere full of potential, of waiting, of watching, of children brimming with excitement and expectation, poring over soon-to-be belongings, pets, brooms, cauldrons, wands. A flash of anger flashed over her mind. Septimus was a wizard after all, and he was going to Hedgewards. Did Cleus really think he would be the one to go with him to Diagon Alley, to choose his wand with him? She dashed it down. It wouldn't be him, and he knew he was out of line. No. Cecilia smiled. She, his mother, would be with him when he walked into Ollivanders that day, when he chose his wand. Or, rather, when his wand chose him. Closing her eyes, Cecilia basked in the ever-increasing warmth of the morning sunlight, as the world turned on its axis and brought the Lupin cottage, on its patch of Cumbrian countryside, closer to the sun. It was Septimus who woke Cecilia up, rather than the other way round. She dozed back off to sleep that morning, expecting that it would be her who would be knocking tentatively on his door, trying to prise the lad from his bed. Instead, and for the 5th time in as many days, Septimus was taking it out in the springs of Cleus's bed. "Come on, Mum. Wake up." Muzzily she opened one eye as her son looked intently at him. "Are you getting up, or what?" In a country that was proud to have integrated its wizard and non-wizard cultures, at least as far as the government was concerned, there was something comfortingly wizardly in Diagonally, with its winding streets, cobbled pavements, dark, Gothic buildings, so old and curmudgeonly it oozed magic. They appeared by way of the pre-arranged flue connection in front of the hearth in the leaky cauldron. Already the place was buzzing with excitement, with the bustle of people. Lots of people, using the time preterm start to reacquaint themselves with the place, meet up with old friends, get their shopping, socialize. It was as if one big festival had descended on the collection of magical streets, something the business owners not only keenly relished but depended upon. As such, each shop front shouted its wares loudly, literally, in some cases, with banners, advertising and colorfulness. They stepped out of the magical pub and onto the cobbles and were immediately jostled by wizards and witches and children appearing nearby who were keen to get shopping. Nearby was a flue hub designed from the non-wizard families who had decided to send their children to Hedgewoods. They appeared, with maps and letters with the school seal on, wandering around, locating the shops, appearing with shopping wearing sometimes bemused, intrigued or downright shocked expressions on their faces. Cecilia held Septimus's hand tightly. "So," she said, smiling as the galleons in her purse began to burn a hole from her desire to be the one to look after Septimus's immediate future needs. "Where do you want to go first?" Septimus chose the sweet shop, a typical choice, and Cecilia indulged him in some every flavor beans and half or dozen chocolate frogs. As one of the frogs got hastily devoured and the cart pocketed, Cecilia led them further down as they headed towards Madame Malkin's, passing shops so familiar and so stonily unchanged from the first moment she had ever been to the alley that she could almost swear that the Weasley children were going to call her over so they could have lunch back at the leaky cauldron with them. It was the same old place, but where the shops were changed their differences were marked. Even some of the more familiar shops had altered their frontage advertising, which now encouraged non-wizards of all ages who were due to go to Hedgewoods that they had sufficient choice in non-wizard goods. Flourish and Blots had non-wizard friendly core textbooks where the danger of your hand being removed had been reduced. Ollivanders promised to find suitable substitutes for wands and boasted in a large sign outside that non-wizards got to choose their own wands. Madame Imanus was still there, the gorgeous robes and dresses adorning the windows, and Cecilia had to fight the urge to go in and go shopping for herself. Aelop's Owl Emporium, where Mervyn had come from, had a group of children of Septimus's age with their noses practically glued to the window. It was a similar story outside Quality Quidditch Supplies. Non-wizards catered for was the sign outside the apothecary, although Cecilia wondered whether the goods sold could actually be used in the chemistry lessons proposed by Cleus, who knew little about the subject. It had taken a great deal of effort for Cecilia not to volunteer to do something to help. And in the window of Gringotts the exchange rate for pounds to galleons had just been slightly altered, in big numerals hovering just above the door. 1 galleon could now buy £5.20, down from the £5.22 that it had been when they both passed it. It had to happen, Cecilia thought as Septimus peered into the window of Flourish and Blots as they passed it on the way to the robe shop. If Cleus wanted integration at Hedgewoods, it depended on these shops catering for the few non-wizard families shopping there that day. "Is Julian coming today?" asked Cecilia as she pushed open the door of Madame Malkin's shop. Septimus shook his head. "I asked him, but he's coming tomorrow. His parents are very excited about it." Septimus had explained that both Mr. and Mrs. Scott both had a keen interest in all things magical. As Madame Malkin buzzed around them like an exquisitely tailored bee, they chatted. It was the first time they had both talked like that, like the old times, since she had returned, and Cecilia felt a glow in her heart. She was back and she was enjoying being in the company of her son. She was out of it, out of the yoke of magic. It would not bother her again. Her millstone had gone. Cecilia Lupin was free to get on with her life, with the only decision in front of her being whether they should eat lunch after this or once they had bought everything they'd come for. And Sam says you get to choose some of the subjects you want to study when you get to the third year, but he says there'll probably be different subjects when I get that far, because of the NWS. What do you think, Mum? NWS? Asked Cecilia as Septimus stood 2 feet higher than usual, on a satin block, being measured, and his growth until the end of his OWLs being estimated by an elf. The robes altered themselves automatically as the student grew. Patented technology, exclusive to my boutique, Madame Malkin had boasted as they'd entered. Non-wizards. Septimus raised his eyebrows, his brow creasing in the same way his father's did when he looked confused when Cecilia didn't understand something straight away. I mean, they won't be the different subjects, really? Who knows? It'll be exciting. And you'll be able to write to your Uncle K and ask what he has planned, can't you? 3 robes later, 2 his uniform and 1 for smart, and Cecilia was carrying a brown paper parcel under her arm. Now you've got Mervine, she continued as they passed probably the biggest change to the commercial landscape of Diagon. But, do you want one of those pensives? Cecilia gestured to the shop selling portable pensives, a kind of device developed by the ministry. Tabitha Penwright, Cecilia recalled, were now on sale for general use. From what Cecilia could ascertain, and she didn't know much, the device used the Flu network to store the memories of the owner. Such memories could be accessed by other owners of portable pensives, should the original memory provider so wish, by means of a passcode. Teenagers could communicate remotely with one another, safe in the knowledge that only those who they wanted to contact could see their memories. By the look of the queue, which stretched down diagonally and threatening to skew into Nocturne Alley, they were a huge phenomenon. It also meant that the adults queuing with their children could indulge them, safe in the knowledge they could use their own hearths connected to the Flu network to contact their offspring. No. Septimus shook his head. I don't want one. Sure? Cecilia watched as her son followed the train of customers with the varying shapes of the new device in their hands, a clear globe atop through which thoughts could be enticed and fed. Sure. Are you hungry? Lunch is on Uncle K at the Leaky Cauldron. Or there's the bank. I need to organize your pocket money. She waited as Septimus went into a silent, thoughtful manner. Eventually he said, Can we go to the one shop now? Cecilia stopped walking and looked at him, smiling happily. Septimus smiled back. Of course. They passed the second main difference to the street as they made their way to Ollivander's, Cecilia swelling with anticipation. The Daily Prophet's premises used to be at the top end of Diagon but were now located halfway down, at the junction with Nocturne Alley and, judging by the hack-style headlines on their billboards, non-wizards, more closely related to dolphins than wizards. And giants, as big a problem as they'd have you believe, were living up to their notoriety. Gone was the support for the ministry that had pervaded in the old world, and here too, Cecilia remembered. Was there ever a focus of government skepticism more ferocious, more single-minded? She knew it was the bane of Cleus's life, for, as soon as a new initiative was announced, it was condemned in print within minutes. This time the headline simply reported a number, the number 42. This was, according to the subheading on the paper itself, was the amount of non-wizards who had been the subject of conjurist attacks. The newspaper then went on to question the wisdom of banning conjurists and the freedom of magical practice, claiming that, if the government was really concerned with non-wizards, they should allow conjurists their freedom rather than try to curtail it. On the wall to the right of the building, as had been daubed every so often down the street, a symbol that reinforced the prophet's point, a circled C, the symbol of the conjurists, activists and radicals, who had begun to press their point even in this ancient street. "Mum," said Septimus, as they stopped outside the one shop. "I wish Dad was with us." Cecilia sighed, and smiled kindly at her son. "So do I, little Tim," she replied, before adding to herself, "You wouldn't believe how much I wish he was with us." The thin-paned door, whose glass moved in its frame as Septimus leaned on the handle, creaked open, the bell tinkling overhead as he stepped in. Cecilia followed behind, watching as her son surveyed the walls and ceiling. Floor to ceiling were stacked boxes of different sizes and shapes, grey, blue, black, buff, made of thick card, wood or animal skin. Cecilia looked up, towards the spindly candles that hung from their holders from the ceiling, only to find that more boxes made up the ceiling. Shelves went up as far as the eye could see. How far up could they be? The stack seemed to rise higher than the confines of the building, and her analytical mind began to calculate the volume of wands that must be stored up there. 394,115. The words crackled from an aged voice box. Its owner, now standing before Cecilia and Septimus, who was equally awed, but was more likely to get away with it, being only 11, shot his eyes to the elderly wizard standing before him. Septimus turned quickly to look at his mother, and Cecilia stepped forward. "Hello, sir," she began, but Ollivander ignored her and looked directly at Septimus. "Where do we start? Now where do we start?" It wasn't a question. No sooner as the wizard, presumably Ollivander, had spoken the words, he had turned on his heel, before turning back and, watching Septimus intently, whose gaze had wandered to the top left-hand corner of the shop, and he strode in that direction with more power than his frail legs betrayed before scrambling up a ladder. Within minutes he had climbed down, striding back and placing the wand on the table. Cecilia watched as intently as Septimus, whose hand hovered halfway between his waist and the wand, wanting to touch it but equally cautious. Go on, encouraged Ollivander, in a tone that Cecilia recognized herself using from time to time. "Put that in the chemical mixture you've made. What will happen?" "I've no idea," and both he and Cecilia watched as Septimus's hand approached. A low growl, like an animal warning of imminent attack should he continue, came from the wand, and Septimus Ollivander clicked his tongue, as if in scolding, and stared at the wand before shaking his head. No. He looked at Septimus as if the boy took his meaning entirely. 9 inches. Beech. Titanium core, he added, as if each subsequent clarification should make his point increasingly understandable. Swiping it away, he closed his eyes, opening them sharply as a rustling sound above caught his attention. "So you think you're his wand?" he asked the noisy wand crossly. "All right, if you insist." Cecilia watched as the wizard reached up to a shelf hidden behind the counter before a wrestling match ensued between him and a slim, tan leather case. "Take it," Ollivander encouraged, for, once he laid it on the counter before Septimus, the struggling stopped abruptly, and a wand, of very pale wood, twisted and bent, very long and very thin. No growling this time, or any sound at all save the bustle of the people outside as they walked along the cobbles, talking and laughing. He closed his hand around it and looked at Ollivander, before looking at his mother. "Ivy. No core. Go on," he whispered in a conspiratorial tone, "give it a try." Septimus held it aloft, Cecilia noticing his hand shaking a little. A white spark shot from the backwards end, like a bullet, shattering the glass behind Septimus and ricocheting off the wall of flourish and blots. Treachery! Treachery! Ollivander grabbed the wand hastily from the counter where, in fright, Septimus had dropped it. Cecilia placed a hand gently on her son's shoulder and he smiled nervously. Ollivander was having a wrestling match with the wand. As he tried to get it back into its case, it shifted and rattled in its rage at being contained as the wizard muttered words such as, "Faithless fay that you are, O twisted hag," as he eventually won the fight. 7 others later, which either fizzed, crackled or simply did nothing, and Cecilia's son looked at her, downcast. She could see what was in his mind, that, as she had done, Septimus had thought his wand would choose him quickly. "Don't worry, love, your wand will be here, somewhere. Mr. Ollivander has got over 300,000, and you've not seen 10 yet." Ollivander's eyes narrowed as Cecilia's words seemed to interrupt him from his train of thought, and he looked at the boy with curiosity. No, nothing to worry about," the wizard reiterated. "Time means nothing when your wand is choosing you. Often young wizards can be here an hour or so, the wands for boys take longer to discover them. And only last week a young witch was in here for 5 hours before her wand found her. No, we'll keep going." 10 minutes later, and a manner of other wands had been laid before Septimus. He had laid his hand on everyone, and everyone had elicited a verbal label from Ollivander: oak, 7 inches, its core is most unusually mouse tailbones. You, some say unlucky, 11 3/4, dragon's wing quill core. When he reached the next, hawthorn, 10 11/12, phoenix feather. Septimus put his hand on the wand unenthusiastically. Then he stopped, before turning to his mother, a big smile on his face. "It feels right." Cecilia reached down and hugged Septimus tightly. The euphoria of that moment made her want to cry, and she felt tears prick her eyes. To have missed this moment was unthinkable. "I'm so proud of you, dear," she said, close to his ear, and she hugged him again. "Wands choose their wizards, you see," said Mr. Ollivander as he stood away from the counter and beamed at Septimus. "In your case, it's as clear, very clear." "What's clear?" asked Septimus as his mother put 3 galleons on the counter. Ollivander ignored Cecilia and bent in towards him, a smile on his face and a knowing expression. "It will be clear to you soon enough, young man," he replied, before nodding at the wizard money and putting 2 nuts and a silver sickle next to them. Flourish and Blots was their next stop, and Cecilia's natural affinity for all things paper-bound paled at the happiness she felt when she thought of the fact that she had been with him when her son had got his wand. They bought the standard books, and she asked Septimus if she wanted anything for himself. He chose a book on Quidditch, with which came a small book about the players, rules, and a fold-out model pitch. Cecilia smiled to herself as they paid for the books. "So, you're not hungry now, are you?" she asked as she turned left as they got outside the bookseller's, past 3 more graffitied circled C's. "Mum, I am," replied Septimus, his brow crinkling. "I thought you said we were going back to the Leaky Cauldron next." It was true, Cecilia had mentioned food, but she also knew they would have to leave straight afterwards. She didn't want to have come to Diagonally without the second most important thing she had wanted to get for her son, something she had told no one about. And Callias, despite all she despised him for, had paid her directly into her Gringotts account. All ministry employees had one, so technically she could be thought of as one of them, she had told herself wryly. She hadn't needed to spend a great deal when she had been at Durmstrang. Her meals and accommodation were provided, and what could you buy when you were in a castle perched on a rock in the North Sea? So she had a fair sum available. "I just want to pop into a shop down here," she explained. "It won't be long, just bouts, the apothecary. We'll go to lunch straight after, okay?" Septimus nodded, walking beside his mother and peeping into his bag of books, trying to read the blurb on the back of his Quidditch book. Before they had gone too far, Cecilia stopped abruptly and began to stare into the window of the shop. It was a moment or two before Septimus noticed that they were outside the Quidditch supplies shop. In the window was the latest model sports broom, lightweight but strong, streamlined, its stark polished wood glowing gloriously in the shafts of summer sunlight that had made their way down into diagonally and shone to its best as it hung in the very center of the shop's display. "Your dad's broom is in the cellar, have you dug it out yet?" Septimus had long since accepted that he was taking Remus's old school broom with him when he went to Hedgewoods. He nodded. "Good lad. We can go in and get a few things for you, if you like." A big smile spread across his face. "Cool," he replied. "That'd be ace, Mum." She opened the door for Septimus, who stepped in with renewed enthusiasm, goggling at the shop's vast and varied goods. "Do you know anything about brooms? That one, for example?" "It's fab," he said, looking the broom over. "I mean, all the top players have one like that. It's a Lightning Shot 9099. The last they're ever going to make." "The last they've made," clarified the short, tubby man from behind the counter. "The last they'll ever make. The Firebolt Company have turned their back on broomsticks and gone into the pensive business, so it'll be nimbuses from now on, I suppose. Not as fast though, but that's progress." He shook his head and glimpsed out of the window at the long line of people still outside the shop opposite. "This is the last one still available commercially." From around the shop a universal gasp came from the dozen or so prospective young customers, though, in all likelihood, browsers and handlers, and several moved as one, like a ship in calm water, towards where Septimus and Cecilia stood. She noticed the price tag. It would cost all she had. "So," she asked brightly, turning to her son. "It's up to you. Some accessories to start you off at school? Gloves? Shin pads? A broom cloak?" Cecilia stepped away from the window display and looked purposefully at the shelves stacked floor to ceiling with Quidditch-related things. She waited long enough for the silent awe to plant itself in Septimus's mind. He looked up at his mother expectantly. Cecilia smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Or, you could have the Lightning Shot,